When most people think of the Old West, they imagine legends like Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, or even Billy the Kid. But for each of these famous gunslingers, there were dozens of others every bit as dangerous, if not more so. Desperate characters who lived and died by the gun, but whose stories, for whatever reason, have mostly fallen by the wayside. Join me today as we examine 4 such men. First up is the toughest nails Leadville marshal, Mart Duggan. Originally from Ireland, Duggan got his start out west prospecting for gold. Quickly garnered a reputation as a man not to be trifled with, and by the time he arrived in Leadville, he had a total of 7 notches to his name. And when the town marshal was shot dead in April of 1878, it was Duggan who took his spot. Only problem was Marshal Duggan had a hard time adjusting to a more civilized frontier. And it was this failure to get with the times, along with his heavy-handed tactics, that would ultimately lead him to an early grave. Next, we'll discuss King Fisher, a man who once shot a circus tiger just so he could make a pair of chaps from its hide. At the height of his career, Fisher commanded an army of over 100 bandits, ruling South Texas as if it were his own personal kingdom. He'd clean up his act later in life, even to the point of pinning on a badge, only to then fall in one of the bloodiest ambushes of the American West. After Fisher, we'll take a look at the criminally underrated Tom Bear River Smith. Armed with nothing but a badge, a banjo, and his own 2 fists, Smith managed to bring law and order to the rough cow town of Abilene, Kansas. Or at least he did until a vicious fight to the death caused him to lose his head. Literally. And finally, we'll close things out with mysterious Dave Mather, a sometimes outlaw and sometimes lawman who brushed shoulders with the likes of Doc Holliday and Dave Rudaball, only to live up to his namesake and disappear under very mysterious circumstances. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Yeehaw! Martin J. Duggan was born in Ireland on November 10, 1847. His parents would migrate to the United States when he was still a child, spent a few years in the Irish slums of New York City before heading west, first in Nebraska and then Colorado. I'm not entirely sure where they initially settled in Colorado, but by the year 1870, they were farming just outside of Denver. You can actually find a 23-year-old Martin on that year's census, still living there at the farm with his parents and siblings. Now, real quick, let me just go ahead and toss out my usual disclaimer. There's just not a lot of information out there regarding Duggan's early life, and what little I was able to find is either patently false or just unverifiable. For instance, legend has it that he fled New York City after the draft riots of 1863, but we know that's not true because his family was already living in Nebraska by 1859. Oh, hang on a second, I need to blink real quick. If you don't mind, I'm going to try to take a little break about every 2 minutes or so and visibly blink on camera. There's a lot of concerned viewers on YouTube thinking maybe that I don't blink enough, so I don't want anyone to worry. My eyes are sufficiently hydrated, okay, and I will try to blink more often. Now, there's another story about Mart and one of his brothers being captured by the Lakota during that same period. Hell, Duggan even supposedly fought against Red Cloud up in Montana when he was driving freight. I've read that he was a bronco buster in Salt Lake City and even a performer in a variety act. Truth is, we don't really know what Duggan was up to in the early 1870s. We don't even know for sure when he first left home. Thankfully, though, by 1875, things do begin to clear up. He spent that summer penning for gold on the outskirts of Georgetown, Colorado. And later on that winter, he got a job in Georgetown proper as a dance hall bouncer. Say what you will about Duggan, but as head bouncer, the man most definitely ran a tight ship. He basically just had 3 simple rules. Number 1, never underestimate your opponent. Expect the unexpected. Number 2, take it outside. Never start anything inside the dance hall unless it's absolutely necessary. And 3, be nice. If someone gets in your face and calls you a cocksucker, Duggan wanted you to be nice. Ask the man to walk, but be nice about it. If you won't walk him, but be nice. And if you can't walk him, one of the other bouncers or maybe even a bartender will help you, and you'll both be nice. And no, that's not actually what Duggan said. That's Patrick Swayze from the movie Roadhouse. The rest was true, though. Duggan did spend the summer of 1875 prospecting, and he did indeed take a job as a bouncer over in Georgetown's Occidental Dance Hall and Saloon. In fact, it's right there at the Occidental where he made his bones as a gunfighter. You see, one evening, a patron got a little too drunk and decided to shoot out all the interior lights in the saloon. Luckily, Duggan was on hand and able to grab the man's revolver, which he then used to deliver a thorough ass whooping. The drunk, battered but still defiant, told Duggan that he didn't think he'd do so well in a stand-up gunfight. And Duggan replied by tossing the bloody revolver across the room and marching outside. He then stopped on the opposite side of the street, turned around, and waited. Sure enough, here comes the drunk just a few moments later, pistol in hand. But like I said, Duggan was waiting. He likewise cleared leather and managed to drill his opponent straight through the heart. A miners' court was convened, but all present declared that the killing was justifiable. Once again, we don't really know what Duggan was up to for the remainder of that year, but by 1878 he was residing in the bustling boomtown of Leadville. Now, Leadville was still very new in 1878, but by 1879 its population had skyrocketed to around 18,000. There were 19 hotels, 38 restaurants, 3 undertakers, 82 saloons, 35 whorehouses, and nearly 24 gambling joints. And if you caught my recent episode on Dallas Studemeyer, Leadville was experiencing the same exact problem as El Paso when it came to finding a suitable town marshal. The first man to pin on the badge was T.H. Harrison. He'd only last a total of 2 days before being beaten and chased out of town. Skip ahead to the following month, and Harrison's successor, an old boy by the name of George O'Connor, was shot dead by one of his own deputies, a deputy who just so happened to be aligned with Leadville's criminal element. So, with no other choice, the mayor and city council turned to our very own Mart Duggan. Turns out that gunfight back in Georgetown was reported in newspapers as far away as Chicago. And by the time Duggan arrived there in Leadville, he had already killed an additional 6 men. Allegedly. Like I said earlier, we don't really know for sure what he had been up to. Also, there was another Duggan in that same area, like a decade prior, who killed several prospectors before being strung up by a lynch mob. So it's thought that maybe he and our Duggan are sometimes sort of mixed up. Either way, like I said, by the time he arrived there in Leadville, he did have a rather rough reputation. And it's this reputation that ultimately got him appointed as marshal, much to the chagrin of all the local ne'er-do-wells. The last thing they wanted was someone like Duggan stepping in and ruining all their fun. Matter of fact, no sooner had he pinned on the badge than he received an anonymous note telling him to get the hell out of town. Oh, gotta blink. Duggan would later tell a reporter, quote, "Immediately after I was appointed marshal, I received a written notice from the roughs to leave town, and if I stayed for 24 hours, I would follow George O'Connor. I paid no attention to the notice, but took every precaution to always be on guard." Duggan also noted that the town was not only full of thieves, thugs, and desperate characters, but there were some quarrelsome miners determined that no newcomer should have authority over them. And yeah, it wasn't too long before these so-called quarrelsome miners and desperate characters began to test him. On one night in particular, they started getting rowdy inside a saloon and tearing up all the furniture. Duggan arrived, alone, identified the leader, and ordered him to step outside. When the man asked what would happen if he refused to go, Duggan told him to, quote, "Say a Hail Mary, because you're a dead man where you stand." Legend has it that the saloon fell as silent as a mouse fart and that the troublemaker dutifully obeyed. And it wasn't just the hardened criminals who faced Duggan's wrath. This guy really was a stickler when it came to doing things his way. He'd fire his own deputies at the drop of a hat for even the slightest of infractions. And if they refused to do as they were told, he'd deal out justice with a good old-fashioned pistol whipping. Even his own boss, the mayor, wasn't safe. I guess at one point he locked up one of the mayor's wealthy friends, and when the mayor complained, Duggan threatened to throw his ass behind bars as well. Hell, he even fired a municipal magistrate for being too soft on crime. When the judge asked by what authority a mere city marshal had to oust a judge, Duggan pulled out his revolver, stuck it under the magistrate's nose, and marched him out of his office. So yeah, I think it's safe to say that Marshal Duggan wasn't all that easily intimidated. His courage was really put on display one evening when a large group of vigilantes showed up at the jail looking to lynch one of his prisoners. Duggan would later recall, quote, "I started out alone to get ahead of the mob. I stood out in the middle of the street with a cocked revolver in each hand and told them I would kill the first man who attempted to pass. I managed to make them understand that some of them were sure to be killed if they persisted. And from that time on, they understood that I would not do to fool with." End of quote, and hell yeah, brother. This scene would be repeated not long thereafter when a guy named Jim Bush shot and killed an unarmed man. Vigilantes once again came calling, looking to throw a necktie party, but Duggan held them off long enough for Bush to be transported to Denver under heavy guard. So yeah, all in all, not a bad showing by Marshal Duggan. Oh, one second. Gotta blink. Only problem was he seemed to have the same affliction we spoke of a couple of weeks ago regarding Dallas Studenmeyer. And that affliction was a strong fondness for hard liquor. When Duggan was sober, he was said to be well-mannered and soft-spoken. But once he started drinking is when things took a turn for the worse. According to a local paper, quote, under the influence of liquor, he, Duggan, was the incarnation of deviltry and had as little regard for human life as a wild beast. And to paraphrase Leadville historian George Wilson, Duggan swaggered about town, eager for a challenge. Quick with both fist and gun, he terrorized innocent and guilty alike, boldly hunting out the most bloodthirsty desperados to force a duel, and just as boldly assaulting innocent citizens on any or no provocation. But for all of his brutality and lawlessness, he was considered absolutely fearless, as well as being the only man in camp able to intimidate the various roughs and cutthroats. End of quote. This episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is brought to you by me, Josh. Let me ask you a question real quick. What if every time you went to go check the date, you discovered something new about the Old West? Or better yet, what if you found out that you shared a birthday with someone like Jesse James? Or that your wedding anniversary was on the same day as the Battle of Little Bighorn? Sounds pretty cool, right? Well, that's why I went ahead and created the Legends and Outlaws wall calendar. And no, this is not just some boring calendar with the show's logo plastered on it. Not only does it include traditional holidays, stuff like Christmas and 4th of July, but you'll also find all kinds of notable dates from the Old West. Everything from birthdays to deaths and even historic shootouts involving guys like Billy the Kid and Wild Bill Hickok. For instance, I am currently recording this on October 27th. Hang on a second. Here we go. October 27th, 2025 is when I'm recording this ad spot right now, okay? Just yesterday was the 144th anniversary of the gunfight at the OK Corral. And today, at least as of this recording, marks the birthday of Joseph Medicine Crow. I did an episode on Mr. Medicine Crow a long time ago, but if you're not familiar, he was the last war chief of the Great Crow Nation. This dude was raised by actual warriors who roamed the Great Plains and grew up to count coup on Nazis during World War II. And if there's one thing I like more than Old West history, it's Nazis getting their heads bashed in. And tomorrow, at least as of this recording, marks the birth of the great cattle king, John Chisholm. It's all here on the calendar, and as you can see, there were plenty of other notable dates that also occurred in October. Everything from the Daltons getting wiped out over in Coffeyville to the death of Richard Two Gun Hart. Remember him? Al Capone's prohibition agent brother. And even the day that Tom Tobin delivered the head of Felipe Espinosa. It's all there on the calendar. But wait, there's more. Each month also features a different full-page historical photo. And yeah, the photos are different for every single month. We got everyone from Billy the Kid to Judge Roy Bean, and even my own personal favorite, Sitting Bull wearing sunglasses. Okay, so if you're tired of boring wall calendars and you want to surround yourself with all the gunslingers and warriors and outlaws of the American West that we normally talk about here on the Wild West Extravaganza, head on over to wildwestcalendar.com and secure a calendar, or 2 or 3. I really do think this is a great gift for any history buffs in your life, or Western fans, or just anyone who appreciates a nice quality piece of art. And it's just in time for Christmas, all right? Or Hanukkah or Kwanzaa or whatever you celebrate. So what are you waiting for? That's wildwestcalendar.com. 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 Don't just mark the date, make it legendary. Now, let's get back to the show. So yeah, I don't think anyone doubted Duggan's courage. But still, you can't just be walking around all willy-nilly and threatening civilians, especially when you're the damn marshal. And when Duggan got drunk and severely beat a bartender, brandishing his sidearm while doing so, the city council finally got fed up and took his badge. Temporarily. Turns out it ain't much of a crime whacking a surly bartender. And besides, the victim ended up withdrawing his charges, so the city council just reinstated Duggan as if nothing ever happened. And honestly, from what I can tell, despite these periodic drunken outbursts, Duggan really was pretty good at keeping the peace. That being the case, the city council did offer to reappoint him as marshal when his term came to an end in April of 1879. Duggan declined, though, and instead he took an extended trip with his wife to Michigan. And sure enough, without him around, crime once again shot through the roof there in Leadville. And just to give you an idea how bad things got that summer, a newspaper would report that there is a general feeling that every man must be his own bodyguard and be prepared to shoot down anyone who attempts to invade his personal or property rights. and that, quote, bunkos positively, unequivocally, and without the least reservation of mind or matter, have things their own way in Leadville. Footpads may rob a man in broad daylight on the most public of streets, and there is no civil power in Colorado that can give the robbed redress, end of quote. Bunko, of course, is just another way of saying con man. And footpads, if I'm not mistaken, were your run-of-the-mill pickpockets or thieves. Oh, gotta blink. Now, things finally came to a head in late November when vigilantes stormed the jail and lynched a couple of the prisoners, something that would have never happened under Duggan's watch. They then placed a placard around one of their victims' necks that read, quote, notice to all thieves, bunko steerers, footpads, and chronic bondsmen for the same, and sympathizers for the above class of criminals. This is our commencement, and this shall be your fates. We mean business, and let this be your warning, end of quote. It was signed Vigilantes Committee, and followed by the phrase, we are 700 strong. So in turn, the criminals also began mobilizing. They claimed to outnumber the vigilantes and said that they not only knew all of their names, but they were going to hang each and every single one of them. And then when they were done with that, they would burn Leadville to the ground. So yeah, things were really falling apart without Duggan. Finally, the city's founders located him up there in Michigan and begged for him to return. According to Duggan, quote, the city council telegraphed me at Flint, Michigan, asking me to come back at once and take the marshalship as they did not believe anyone else could prevent the roughs from running the town. I came back at once. And yeah, just like before, Duggan hit the ground running. He fired the entire police force, and then, to quote historian Robert D. Arment, set about cracking heads and arresting thugs. Duggan even apprehended such notables as Big Ed Burns and Billy Thompson, brother of the famous Texas gunfighter Ben Thompson. And once his term was officially complete in April of 1880, he once again refused reappointment, opting instead to open a livery stable. He was still ready to throw down, though, if need be, and he never did seem to be too far from the action. Case in point, later on that spring, there was a big strike at one of the nearby mines. The owners rejected the prospectors' demands and began raising an army of hard cases to squash the rebellion. Things got so tense that the governor had to send in the state militia. The only problem was the bulk of the militiamen were sympathetic to the miners. There were even rumors that the prospectors and the militia were planning on joining forces and attacking the bosses. Finally, the militia's own commander, General Cook, had to call in a local Leadville militia known as the Tabor Tigers, an outfit comprised mostly of gamblers, bartenders, and at least one livery owner by the name of Mart Duggan. Matter of fact, Duggan was the militia's second in command. He and his men did as ordered, arresting over 200 people and helping to bring about a peaceful resolution. Now, despite taking such a proactive role in local affairs, Duggan still remained just as quarrelsome as ever, especially when he was full of that drink. In late November of 1880, he was delivering a fancy sleigh to a house of ill repute when a guy named Lewis Lamb stepped out in front of him. Damn near got himself ran over. Apparently, these two guys had butted heads previously, so this latest interaction quickly led to an exchange of what I can only assume were some not-so-polite words. Gotta blink. Lamb ended up turning and walking away, but Duggan followed, just pretty much calling him everything but a son of God. By the time they reached the whorehouse, Lamb had had enough. He demanded that Duggan apologize. And when the former marshal told him to go to hell, is when Lamb reached for his pistol. Big mistake. Duggan may have been an asshole, but he was still pretty quick on the draw. In one fluid motion, he jumped off the sleigh and put a bullet straight in Lamb's mouth, killing him instantly. Now, despite Duggan being cleared on grounds of self-defense, not everyone was on his side. Turns out Lamb was a rather popular guy, and as a result, Duggan's livery stable began losing business. To make matters worse, Lamb's wife swore that she'd continue wearing her quote-unquote widow's weeds long enough to dance on Duggan's grave. Finally, when the stable went belly up, Duggan was forced to sell his home and move to a nearby mining camp known as Douglas City. It's there where he found work as a deputy sheriff. And despite the West becoming more and more civilized with each new day, Duggan remained just as rough as ever. Like the time in 1887 when several soiled doves were conned into buying some fake jewelry by a traveling salesman. Duggan not only hunted the guy down, but he gave him a good working over. He then marched him, bruised and bloodied, down the street to the dance hall and forced him to return the money that he took from the girls. No word on whether or not Duggan received house credit for this good deed. Now, that salesman would end up pressing charges over in Leadville. The judge not only found Duggan guilty of assault, but he also fined him $10 and ordered him to pay the court fees, a verdict that Duggan did not take lying down. He demanded that the salesman pay the fine for him, and he told the judge to basically shove the court costs up his ass. I'm not sure how the judge responded, but the salesman was sufficiently frightened into dropping the charges altogether. Believe it or not, Duggan would actually return to Leadville later on that year and take a job as a police patrolman. And once again, despite the change in times, he continued dishing out frontier justice. Per historian Robert D. Arment, quote, "If Leadville had discarded much of its wild roughness, Mart Duggan did not. He was constantly in trouble because of the heavy-handed approach to law enforcement that had served him well in earlier times and had brought him local fame and respect." End of quote. Duggan was fined again in March of 1888 after roughing up yet another traveling salesman. And this time he was fined a whopping $25, a turn of events that led to Duggan resigning from the police force and going on an extended bender. Hell, he was still drinking 2 weeks later when he got into a heated argument inside a gambling joint there in Leadville. For whatever reason, he had taken to verbally harassing one of the faro dealers. And when the establishment's owner, Bailey Youngson, intervened, Duggan invited the both of them to step outside and settle things like gentlemen, a challenge that they immediately declined. Worth noting that this was around 4 o'clock in the morning, so I'm next to certain that Duggan was fully 3 sheets to the wind. Nevertheless, several of his buddies were able to calm him down and convince him to go home and sleep it off. Duggan agreed and staggered outside, or at least he tried to. He only made it a few steps outside the door when someone slipped up behind and shot him in the back of the head. Miraculously, he would remain alive for the next 7 hours. He came to around about sunup and asked for a drink of water. When the deputies inquired as to the identity of his killer, Duggan replied that it was the aforementioned Bailey Youngson, before once again losing consciousness. When he awakened later on, he was once more questioned by authorities. This time he simply stated that he had been struck down by, quote-unquote, one of the gang. And when the police asked if it was Bailey Youngson, Duggan said no, and that he died before he'd ever tell them. And those were Martin Duggan's last words. He gave up the ghost later on that morning at just 39 years of age. Believe it or not, it was 10 years to the day that he had originally pinned on that marshal's badge. The saloon owner Youngson was arrested, so was the faro dealer, but they were cleared of all charges. It wasn't until years later that the true killer was possibly revealed. Turns out it was most likely another faro dealer named George Evans, and it didn't have anything to do with Duggan harassing that other dealer. According to Robert D. Arment, quote, "Those professing to be in the know claimed that Evans was paid to murder the former marshal by a group who held old grudges against him. Evans left Colorado soon after his release and went on a tour of Mexico and Central America, reportedly funded by those unnamed enemies of Duggan." End of quote. Evans was eventually killed in a gunfight down in South America in 1902, and when news reached Colorado, that's when people began opening up about his role in Duggan's murder. Now, Duggan's funeral was held in Denver. He was buried at the Riverside Cemetery in an unmarked grave, thus depriving Widow Lamb from dancing on it. She did allegedly do a jig on the blood-soaked sidewalk where he was shot, though. She also left her widow weeds on Mrs. Duggan's doorstep. It wasn't until 2005 that Martin finally received a gravestone. Apparently, a group of history aficionados there in Denver raised over $2,000 for it. Per the group's organizer, Gail Lindley, quote, "This guy is an unsung hero. He really transformed a depraved Leadville. He brought law and order to a lawless town. As a fallen officer, he deserves the honor and respect of a memorial stone." End of quote. And yeah, that's about all I've got on Martin J. Duggan. Yeehaw! Kingfisher was not your average Texas gunfighter. After all, this is a guy who once killed a circus tiger just so he could make a pair of chaps out of its hide. He boasted of killing 37 men, not counting Mexicans and Indians, and at the height of his career, he had over 100 bandits riding under his command, ruling all of South Texas as if it were his own personal kingdom. And all that while dressed like a fashion show reject. Gold embroidered jackets, rattlesnake hat bands, bells on his spurs, and yeah, even those infamous tiger skin chaps. But who was Kingfisher? I mean, really. How's a man go from being an outlaw warlord to wearing a sheriff's badge, only to then be gunned down in one of the most mysterious ambushes in all of Old West history? Stick around and find out. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. John King Fisher was born in October of 1853 in what's now Collin County, Texas. Sadly, his mother Lucinda passed away just a couple of years later, at which point his father Job moved the family south to Karnes County. He would remarry, but I guess he had a little too much in common with his biblical namesake, as wife number 2 also passed away. After which the family moved again, this time to the bustling metropolis of Goliad. Worth noting that King Fisher did not get along with his stepmother. Or I guess I should say he didn't get along with her while she was still alive. There's even a story about her hanging him up from the doorway by his suspenders while she was doing chores, just to get him out of the way. Sounds a little extreme, but then again, young Fisher was reportedly quite the handful, very mischievous. And to make matters worse, when he reached his early teens, he also became very popular with the young ladies, which in my opinion is not a good thing, at least not at that age. I don't know about you, but I feel like all those early years of constant rejection from the opposite sex led me to becoming the humble, well-adjusted, and self-loathing person I am today. It's never a good thing to have too much success early on. Just ask Justin Bieber. Now, if being a teenage heartthrob ain't bad enough, King also started hanging out with the wrong crowd. In fact, he even got arrested for stealing a horse when he was just 15 years old. He'd be arrested yet again a year later after breaking into a house, and this time he wouldn't get off so easy. At just 16 years of age, Fisher was sentenced to 2 years in the state penitentiary. Luckily for him, they cut him some slack due to his youth, and he only ended up serving 4 months. From there, King drifted south and began working cattle, just like so many other wayward young men. Now, this area in question is known as the Nueces Strip, a lawless region in South Texas located roughly between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. Apparently, local ranchers were experiencing a good deal of stock theft, and when the local law proved ineffective, they formed a vigilante group. According to historian Leon Metz, it was these same ranchers who, quote, employed Fisher to clean out the rustlers, and his reputation soared as a man of courage, end of quote. Now look, I'm not a big fan of vigilante justice, but I do think it's understandable, especially when the official law either can't or won't intervene. But then again, mob justice never ends well. It's messy, there's no due process, and innocent men tend to get strung up right alongside the crooked. It also tends to be the case that these so-called vigilantes will invariably end up doing the very same thing they're supposed to be preventing. King Fisher and his bunch were no exception, and over time they too began stealing cattle. By the way, before we go any further, I do think we need to address Fisher's somewhat unconventional fashion sense. A Texas Ranger would once describe him as wearing an ornamented sombrero, a black Mexican jacket embroidered with gold, a crimson sash, crimson boots, and with 2 silver-plated, ivory-handled revolvers swinging from his belt. Another ranger noted that Fisher was partial to a beaver hat with a solid gold band in the shape of a rattlesnake. He also wore silk shirts, silk bandanas, and even a pair of chaps made from the skin of a tiger that he had allegedly killed at a circus. Oh, and he also wore bells on his spurs, because I guess the normal jingle-jangles of spurs sometimes just ain't enough. And yeah, in case you're wondering if you're imagining things or not, yes, I did just say that King had chaps that he made from the skin of a Bengal tiger. That is a true story. So just to sum things up, we've got a bedazzled sombrero, bedazzled jacket, gold rattlesnake hatband, red sash, tiger striped chaps, and bells on his spurs. It's almost as if the cowboy from the Village People looked at himself in the mirror one day and was like, you know what? I don't think I look gay enough. How can I turn it up to 11? This episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is brought to you by me, Josh. Let me ask you a question real quick. What if every time you went to go check the date, you discovered something new about the Old West? Or better yet, what if you found out that you shared a birthday with someone like Jesse James? Or that your wedding anniversary was on the same day as the Battle of Little Bighorn? Sounds pretty cool, right? Well, that's why I went ahead and created the Legends and Outlaws wall calendar. And no, this is not just some boring calendar with the show's logo plastered on it. Not only does it include traditional holidays, stuff like Christmas and 4th of July, but you'll also find all kinds of notable dates from the Old West. Everything from birthdays to deaths and even historic shootouts involving guys like Billy the Kid and Wild Bill Hickok. For instance, I am currently recording this on October 27th. Hang on a second. Here we go. October 27th, 2025 is when I'm recording this ad spot right now, okay? Just yesterday was the 144th anniversary of the gunfight at the OK Corral. And today, at least as of this recording, marks the birthday of Joseph Medicine Crow. I did an episode on Mr. Medicine Crow a long time ago, but if you're not familiar, he was the last war chief of the Great Crow Nation. This dude was raised by actual warriors who roamed the Great Plains and grew up to count coup on Nazis during World War II. And if there's one thing I like more than Old West history, it's Nazis getting their heads bashed in. And tomorrow, at least as of this recording, marks the birth of the great cattle king, John Chisholm. It's all here on the calendar, and as you can see, there were plenty of other notable dates that also occurred in October. Everything from the Daltons getting wiped out over in Coffeyville to the death of Richard Two Gun Hart. Remember him? Al Capone's prohibition agent brother. And even the day that Tom Tobin delivered the head of Felipe Espinosa. It's all there on the calendar. But wait, there's more. Each month also features a different full-page historical photo. And yeah, the photos are different for every single month. We got everyone from Billy the Kid to Judge Roy Bean, and even my own personal favorite, Sitting Bull wearing sunglasses. Okay, so if you're tired of boring wall calendars and you want to surround yourself with all the gunslingers and warriors and outlaws of the American West that we normally talk about here on the Wild West Extravaganza, head on over to wildwestcalendar.com and secure a calendar, or 2 or 3. I really do think this is a great gift for any history buffs in your life, or Western fans, or just anyone who appreciates a nice quality piece of art. And it's just in time for Christmas, all right? Or Hanukkah or Kwanzaa or whatever you celebrate. So what are you waiting for? That's wildwestcalendar.com. 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 Don't just mark the date, make it legendary. Now, let's get back to the show. Now, physically, Fisher was not a big man. Only 5'9" tall and 135 pounds soaking wet. But be that as it may, you'd be making a grave mistake if you were to confuse the outer man with the inner. I'll give you for instance. Remember that gang of vigilantes / rustlers that King was riding with? Well, one day he got into a heated argument with one of the leaders. Things escalated, and Fisher ended up shooting the man dead. And when 2 of the dead guy's buddies then went for their pistols, Fisher killed them as well. As I'm sure you can imagine, from that point on, he was the undisputed leader of the gang. Him and his tiger chaps. Who's the Tiger King now, bitch? Story goes that Fisher would kill an additional 7 men over the next few months. Not bad for someone barely old enough to shave. By the way, it's worth noting that this wasn't no small gang of rustlers targeting a tiny stretch of land. According to Ranger Captain Leander McNelly, at the height of King's reign, he ruled the entire area between Castroville and Eagle Pass with an army of at least 100 men. Now, he would eventually form a ranch of his own along Pendacia Creek. I can only assume that King enjoyed his privacy as he placed a large sign on the road leading to the ranch, which stated, "This is King Fisher's Road. Take the other one." This ranch, by the way, would serve as a sort of headquarters for he and his gang's activities. Activities that mostly took place on the opposite side of the river. And really, this just goes back to what I said earlier about the Nueces Strip being so lawless. For about as long as anyone could remember, the Texans would cross the Rio Grande and make off with Mexican livestock, and vice versa, with the Mexicans doing the exact same thing. So much so that a lot of skinny cattle there in South Texas spent their entire lives just being herded back and forth across the river. Hell, sometimes King would even strike deals with his Mexican counterparts, people like future president Porfirio Diaz. The pair had an arrangement where they'd exchange stolen livestock and sell them at a profit across the river. Turns out most Texans wouldn't blink an eye when it came to buying cattle with Mexican brands, even if they knew they were stolen. Likewise, when it came to Mexicans purchasing stolen cattle with Texas brands. Now, just to give you an idea how deadly King Fisher truly was, 4 vaqueros arrived at his ranch one day acting like they wanted to start some trouble. King told them to leave, and when they refused, he struck one of them in the head with a branding iron, killing the man almost instantly. He then dropped said iron, pulled out his revolver, and shot the other 3 deader in hell. On another occasion, he was drinking in a saloon a couple of counties over when a cowboy by the name of William Donovan refused to buy him a drink. So naturally, King drew his pistol and gunned Donovan down. He would be arrested for this killing and charged with murder, but he was ultimately found not guilty. Just one of the many times that the courts refused to convict him. Fisher would even brag about it, at one point stating, quote, "You could not persuade a man in this whole country to testify against King Fisher or any of his clan," end of quote. Now, this was a somewhat troublesome development, not only because justice wasn't being served, but also due to Fisher now referring to himself in the third person, which, let's be honest, is never a good sign. He wasn't lying, though. Over time, King would be subjected to over 20 indictments, mostly for murder and theft, all of which were eventually dismissed. Now, Fisher would end up getting married in April of 1876 to a lady by the name of Sarah Vivian. Apparently, she had a calming effect as King did begin to settle down. He started focusing more and more on legitimate work, formed a new ranch, and, believe it or not, he even became a deputy sheriff over in Uvalde County. I say believe it or not because this is actually very common when it comes to Old West history. There were a ton of outlaws who would end up pinning on a badge later on in life. The opposite was also true. Many a lawman, tempted by the idea of turning a quick buck, would find themselves locked up in the very same jails they had once held the keys to. Per Leon Metz in his book The Shooters, quote, "With his talents now on the side of the law, King became a diligent police officer, tracking down Tom and Jim Hanahan, two accused robbers of the El Paso stage. When both men resisted, King killed Tom, captured Jim, and recovered the money." End of quote. So yeah, apparently Fisher really dove into this new job head first. He and Vivian would welcome their first child in late October of 1877, daughter named Florence Fredonia, and over the course of the next 5 years, they'd have 3 more, all of which were girls. May God have mercy on his soul. Then, when the sheriff there in Uvalde County was indicted for dipping his hands in the public till, King took over the job as acting sheriff. He even started campaigning for the election of 1884. Matter of fact, it's his duties as sheriff that brought him to the state capitol in spring of that same year. Texas legislature had recently made fence cutting illegal, so King was looking to learn more about the new law. And as fate would have it, while he was there in Austin, he bumped into his old friend, Ben Thompson. Now, full disclosure, I'm not sure how the two initially met, but Thompson's pretty damn interesting in his own right. Born in England in 1843, his family immigrated to the States and settled in Texas when he was still a young boy. A few years later, he joined up with the Confederate Army, saw action during the battles of Galveston and Lafourche Crossing. After the war, Ben headed south and served under Mexican Emperor Maximilian, fighting against the revolutionaries. He then did a stint over in Huntsville prison after nearly beating his brother-in-law to death, which, if you ask me, ain't much of a crime. Skip ahead to 1870, and Thompson was in Abilene, Kansas, running the Bull's Head Saloon with his partner Phil Coe. Or at least he did before Coe was shot and killed by Wild Bill Hickok in October of 1871. Thomas would later join Bat Masterson during the Royal Gorge Railroad War, and once that little dust-up was over, he moved to Austin and opened up the Iron Front Saloon. He was also appointed as Austin City Marshal. I'm kind of glossing over Thompson's various adventures, but he did not shy away from confrontation. Like in July of 1882, when he got into it with one of the owners of San Antonio's Vaudeville Theater, a guy by the name of Jack Harris. Thompson had lost heavily while gambling there at the Vaudeville and swore up and down that he was going to put him out of business. And when he returned, Harris was waiting on him with a double-barreled shotgun. As Thompson stepped inside, the two began exchanging words, and when Harris went to raise that scatter gun is when Ben shot him in the heart. Although Thompson was later acquitted, this killing would cost him his job as Austin City Marshal, so I got to imagine that he held a grudge. It's also worth noting that he had previously killed the owner of Austin's Capitol Theater as well, so who knows, maybe Thompson just had a hard-on for theater owners. Either way, like I said earlier, he and King would link up in March of 1882, just a few short months after the death of Jack Harris. The pair embarked on a day-long drinking binge there in Austin, and by that night they were on a train headed straight to San Antone. Neither man would be alive come sunrise. Now, I do feel like I need to point out that there are different versions as to why they decided to visit San Antonio in the first place. Remember, King was living in Uvalde, so he was most likely going to be passing through San Antone anyway on his way home. Whether or not he invited Thompson or Thompson invited him, I honestly do not know. There are even some who think that King agreed to join Thompson just to help him smooth things over with Jack Harris's former business partner. Just a way of burying the hatchet. Whatever the case, by the time they arrived, Thompson was already 3 sheets to the wind. He was also in a pretty foul mood, as evidenced by him striking one of the train porters. He actually hit the man so hard that blood splattered all over his hat. So naturally, Thompson pulled out a knife, cut the hat's crown off, and then stuck said knife in the hat's brim. And that is literally how he stepped off the train there in San Antonio. Drunk off his ass, sprinkled in blood, and with a knife poking out of his crownless hat, looking like a goddamn psycho. So yeah, right off the bat, not exactly off to a good start. He and King then hit up the Turner Opera House before moving on to the Vaudeville Theater. Remember, this is the same place where Thompson had killed Jack Harris. They actually caught a ride on a hack, believe it or not, despite the Vaudeville just being a short walk from the Opera House, which I think probably says a lot as to their level of sobriety. Unbeknownst to either King or Thompson, word of their arrival had preceded them. Not only were telegraphs sent ahead of time, but there was a U.S. Marshal on the very same train that had delivered them to San Antone. While King and Thompson were at the Opera House, the deputy had rushed over to warn the owners of the Vaudeville. And in turn, the city marshal was also notified and said that he'd send over 6 officers to keep things cordial. Now keep in mind that at this point, the Vaudeville was being ran by Joe Foster and Billy Sims. Foster was actually one of the original owners, and after Harris's death back in March, he brought Sims in as his new partner. Now when King and Thompson finally got to the Vaudeville, they swung by the bar for a quick drink, after which they headed upstairs to take in a show. Hell, Sims was even kind enough to send up a few working gals to keep him company, or as one historian put it, girls in short skirts and red stockings. Thompson ordered yet another drink as Fisher lit a cigar. And what happened next sort of depends on which version you choose to believe. Kind of scant on details, unfortunately. According to one account, Thompson spied Foster as he and King were leaving and tried to shake his hand. Foster declined, and things just sort of escalated from there. Another goes that Foster and Billy Sims joined Thompson and King upstairs, and that's when Thompson started levying threats. He even began making jokes about killing Jack Harris. Vaudeville bouncer/police officer Jacob Coy urged Ben to keep his mouth shut, but he refused to listen. He even went so far as to call Foster out, but Foster responded by saying that he didn't want no trouble. By this point, everyone was standing up. You had Foster and Sims over by the door with the bouncer Coy, and about 4 feet away and to their right were King Fisher and Ben Thompson. Coy once again urged calm, but Thompson wasn't having it. He jerked iron and attempted to strike Foster with his pistol, but Coy managed to swat the revolver away. And that's when all hell broke loose. When the smoke finally cleared, King Fisher was dead, his body riddled with at least 13 bullets. Thompson was likewise deceased, having received a total of 9 rounds. And to this day, nobody knows exactly what happened or who killed who. Worth noting that both Coy and Foster had also taken rounds. In fact, Foster would die of his wounds just 11 days later. I actually covered Kingfisher a very long time ago, back when this show first started, and I originally stated that while Thompson was immediately killed, King managed to shuck iron and put a bullet in Foster's leg, for he too was cut down. Turns out that's probably not the case. There was an investigation right there at the theater later on that night, and King's revolver was found to be still in his holster and fully loaded. Per a Galveston News article published the following day, quote, Fisher's pistol was found belted around him, undischarged and in its scabbard, a remarkable circumstance for one so quick in drawing and so self-possessed when in danger. End of quote. A more plausible theory regarding Coy and Foster's wounds were that they simply got caught in the crossfire, which I think also explains why 2 accomplished killers like King Fisher and Ben Thompson were so easily killed. You see, there was a separate inquest performed on Thompson, and the forensic evidence strongly suggested that the fatal rounds came from above and slightly behind. In other words, either Foster or Sims had stationed gunmen on the upper level of the theater. And that being the case, neither King nor Thompson even caught so much as a glimpse of their assassins. Hell, they never even had a chance. As far as I know, this has never been explicitly proven, and these alleged gunmen were never identified. Despite the outraged public calling for a grand jury indictment for all involved, nothing ever really came of it. Now, just a quick side note, but the last time I was in San Antonio, I actually paid a visit to where the Vaudeville Variety Theater once stood. I don't recall the exact source, but supposedly it was located on the northwest corner of Commerce and Soledad, which nowadays is home to a Subway. So on the off chance you feel like eating a day-old tuna on flatbread at the same place where 2 noted Old West gunfighters were killed, well, now you know where to go. By the way, that's just a very short walk, like less than 5 minutes, away from where the infamous Council House Massacre took place in 1840. You also have the San Fernando Cathedral right there as well. A lot of really cool history within just a couple of short blocks. But yeah, back to our topic at hand. Kingfisher was transported via train to Uvalde the following day after he was killed. And he was buried the day after that on March 13th. Just 31 years old at the time of his death, by the way. Very young. And yeah, legend has it the king was buried in his tiger skin chaps. Chaps. Keep wanting to call them chaps, but apparently the proper way is chaps. Fine. Now, I barely touched on his wife and kids, but aside from one of his daughters dying as a toddler, the other two would live all the way until the 1950s. Now, even King's widow, Vivian, would live another 63 years, passing away in 1946 at the ripe old age of 89. Oh, one more thing. Remember the guy who King shot and killed while he was acting sheriff, Tom Hanahan? Well, after King himself was shot and killed, Tom's mother traveled to Uvalde, built a fire over his grave, and did a dance around it. Not once, but literally every single year for the rest of her life on the anniversary of her son's death. And I guess that's about all I've got on Kingfisher. Yeehaw! Tom Bear River Smith arrived in Abilene, Kansas with nothing but a badge, a banjo, and a pair of balls seemingly as large as the prairie itself. And within days, he had one of the roughest cowtowns in all of the West eaten out the palm of his hand. And all that without firing a single shot. Sadly, as effective as Tom was, his story does not end with a quiet retirement or a hero's parade. It ended with one of the most brutal killings imaginable, one that shook the citizens of Abilene for the rest of their lives. Who was Bear River Smith? How did a marshal with an aversion to gunplay manage to tame such a wild town? What were the events that led to his untimely and very gruesome death? And what exactly did Smith do to garner the adoration of a future president of the United States? Stick around and find out. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Okay, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, there's just not much known about Tom Smith's early life. Hell, even his birth year is up for debate. Some sources, including census data, suggest that he was born in 1830, while a letter written decades later by one of his mining partners claimed it was closer to 1845. The location of his birth is likewise shrouded in mystery, but most historians do seem to agree that he spent time in the Big Apple prior to heading west, possibly as a police officer. There's even evidence that Smith served with the 69th New York Infantry during the Civil War. Whatever the case, he would head west at some point in the mid-1860s, lured to the frontier with promises of gold and adventure, just like thousands of other ambitious young men. This episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is brought to you by me, Josh. Let me ask you a question real quick. What if every time you went to go check the date, you discovered something new about the Old West? Or better yet, what if you found out that you shared a birthday with someone like Jesse James? Or that your wedding anniversary was on the same day as the Battle of Little Bighorn? Sounds pretty cool, right? Well, that's why I went ahead and created the Legends and Outlaws wall calendar. And no, this is not just some boring calendar with the show's logo plastered on it. Not only does it include traditional holidays, stuff like Christmas and 4th of July, but you'll also find all kinds of notable dates from the Old West. Everything from birthdays to deaths and even historic shootouts involving guys like Billy the Kid and Wild Bill Hickok. For instance, I am currently recording this on October 27th. Hang on a second. Here we go. October 27th, 2025 is when I'm recording this ad spot right now, okay? Just yesterday was the 144th anniversary of the gunfight at the OK Corral. And today, at least as of this recording, marks the birthday of Joseph Medicine Crow. I did an episode on Mr. Medicine Crow a long time ago, but if you're not familiar, he was the last war chief of the Great Crow Nation. This dude was raised by actual warriors who roamed the Great Plains and grew up to count coup on Nazis during World War II. And if there's one thing I like more than Old West history, it's Nazis getting their heads bashed in. And tomorrow, at least as of this recording, marks the birth of the great cattle king, John Chisholm. It's all here on the calendar, and as you can see, there were plenty of other notable dates that also occurred in October. Everything from the Daltons getting wiped out over in Coffeyville to the death of Richard Two Gun Hart. Remember him? Al Capone's prohibition agent brother. And even the day that Tom Tobin delivered the head of Felipe Espinosa. It's all there on the calendar. But wait, there's more. Each month also features a different full-page historical photo. And yeah, the photos are different for every single month. We got everyone from Billy the Kid to Judge Roy Bean, and even my own personal favorite, Sitting Bull wearing sunglasses. Okay, so if you're tired of boring wall calendars and you want to surround yourself with all the gunslingers and warriors and outlaws of the American West that we normally talk about here on the Wild West Extravaganza, head on over to wildwestcalendar.com and secure a calendar, or 2 or 3. I really do think this is a great gift for any history buffs in your life, or Western fans, or just anyone who appreciates a nice quality piece of art. And it's just in time for Christmas, all right? Or Hanukkah or Kwanzaa or whatever you celebrate. So what are you waiting for? That's wildwestcalendar.com. 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 Don't just mark the date, make it legendary. Now, let's get back to the show. Now, it's worth noting that while Tom never received a classical education, he did have talents that went beyond book learning. Physically, he was strong and scrappy, quick with his hands. In fact, he even made a name for himself back east as a middleweight boxer. But at the same time, he also had an artistic side. Word has it that he wasn't too bad with the banjo. He'd often spend hours playing traditional Irish and Scottish folk songs. Or at least that's according to his partner, John Conkey. Smith and Conkey had first met up in 1865 and spent the next couple of years working the gold diggings up in Montana and Idaho. And when that proved unprofitable, they set their sights on Wyoming's South Pass City. According to author Roger Myers, quote, describing the conditions at South Pass, Conkey noted there was no way of controlling the rough elements other than with vigilance committees. The camp was plagued by a number of robberies and murders, and the mine owners suspected a man who disappeared about the same time that one rich miner had been robbed and nearly murdered. At a subsequent miners' meeting, the owners offered up a substantial dead or alive reward for the delivery of the suspect. That evening after supper, Smith, resolving to bring in the criminal, cleaned and loaded his Henry rifle. The subsequent manhunt was his first such venture, and his only authority was the resolution passed at the miners' meeting. He was successful, bringing the man into camp the following day, for which he earned both the reward and a good reputation. End of quote. And yeah, that good reputation would end up serving him well. Matter of fact, about a month or so later, Tom was appointed as marshal over in the town of Green River, about 100 or so miles southwest of South Pass City. Hell, he even tried running as sheriff for the entire county, but ultimately lost the election. Apparently, tensions were running high, as a local paper would report that Smith and a lawyer by the name of Thurman began fighting as the results were announced. Quote, at 3:30 this afternoon, some words in regard to the election passed between J.M. Thurman and Thomas J. Smith, resulting in a resort to knives and pistols. End quote. Thankfully, nobody was killed, at least as far as I know, and Smith soon left for greener pastures. And by greener pastures, I do mean the now ghost town of Bear River, yet another railroad town. Tom once again applied for the position of town marshal, but failed to land the job. So instead, he went to work for the Union Pacific on a grading crew. Now, this next part is pretty interesting. I actually wasn't aware of this being a thing. But back in Green River, there was a newspaper known as the Frontier Index, ran by brothers Lee and Frederick Freeman. You've heard of the show Hell on Wheels, right? Well, the Frontier Index was known as the Press on Wheels, on account of following the Union Pacific as it advanced westward. And for whatever reason, there was a good deal of animosity between Tom Smith and Index co-founder Lee Freeman. Animosity that would only escalate once the Index also arrived there in Bear River. It wasn't just personal, though. For historian Leon Metz, quote, only a few camps along the railroad became semi-permanent, and one was Bear River, Wyoming. It incorporated, passed laws, and even organized police who cracked down on the working man's sins of drunkenness and disorderly conduct. Considering that the railroad hands were terribly exploited, that drinking and fighting and gambling were practically their only recreation, they resented the rigid law enforcement. End of quote. So yeah, as you can see, there was already quite a bit of tension. Straw that broke the camel's back, however, wouldn't come until November of 1868. That's when the Frontier Index called for the lynching of 3 accused murderers, men who just so happened to also be fellow rail graders with Tom Smith. And when Smith caught wind, he organized a mob, and they stormed the jail, freeing the prisoners and burning it to the ground. They followed that up by doing the same thing to the office of the Frontier Index. Take that, Lee Freeman. Troops from Fort Bridger were eventually brought in, and once the smoke settled, at least 14 men lie dead. Smith himself was badly wounded and reportedly on death's door, but luckily he pulled through. Now, you may find sources alleging the exact opposite, that Tom was helping to put an end to the riot, or that he was the town marshal and just sort of stuck in the middle, opposing both sides. I'm not really sure where these stories originate, but contemporary evidence, including newspapers, do indicate that Tom was indeed a leader on the side of the rioters. Matter of fact, he was even forced to spend a few weeks in jail down in Salt Lake City. Years later, a former mayor of Abilene would write the following, quote, "I did not understand at the time why Smith should be leading rioters, and I have never fully cleared that up. I do know, however, that whatever part Smith played in those riots was to his credit." End of quote. Now, following his recovery and release from jail, Tom and his buddy Conkey headed to Cheyenne. It's there where Conkey would open up both a restaurant and a bowling alley, but I guess Smith just weren't ready to settle down. After about 6 months, he headed out yet again. First to Denver and then to the tiny railroad town of Kit Carson, Colorado. A town that I had no idea even existed until researching this episode. And yeah, much like all those other railroad towns we've been discussing, Kit Carson also had a very rough reputation. Matter of fact, if you've ever heard the gunfighter Pat Desmond, he was actually the town marshal. And just as soon as Tom arrived, Pat made him one of his deputies. By all accounts, Smith did one hell of a job, helping Desmond with the usual mix of drunken brawls, petty thefts, and the occasional shootout. But even then, the thing that stood out about Tom was the somewhat unusual way he went about enforcing the law. He wasn't reckless, but at the same time, he weren't exactly timid. Smith rarely pulled a firearm unless absolutely necessary, instead opting to rely on his experience as a pugilist. This restraint would end up earning him a decent amount of respect, not only with fellow deputies, but also the very men he was arresting. I mean, think about it. It's kind of hard to accuse someone of being a coward when they're willing to drop their guns and go toe-to-toe. Meanwhile, about 300 miles to the east, the good folks of Abilene, Kansas had their hands full. Now, Abilene got its start as a stage stop way back in 1857. It was originally known as Mud Creek, by the way. The name Abilene didn't come along until 1860, inspired by a passage in the Gospel of Luke, which briefly mentions a region in Syria with the same name. And yeah, for the next few years, it remained a sleepy little stage stop. Leastways it did until the coming of the Kansas Pacific Railroad in 1867. This would prove to be a very pivotal moment in Western history, and it all came down to supply and demand. You see, following the Civil War, Texas was practically overflowing with cattle. In fact, there were so many cows in Texas that they were essentially worthless, selling for just $2 a head. But back east, it was a completely different story. Supply was low, so the cattle was selling for like 20 times of what they were worth down in Texas. The only problem was figuring out how to get them from Texas to the market back east, and Abilene proved to be the solution. A guy by the name of Joseph McCoy saw the writing on the wall and constructed a massive stockyard on the outskirts of town, one capable of holding as many as 2,000 head of cattle. Fast forward to September 5th, 1867, and the very first shipment of Texas Longhorns departed Abilene via rail, bound for Chicago. Thousands more would soon follow, causing Abilene to become the very first true cow town of the American West. Now that's all fine and dandy, but it obviously wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. In addition to Texas cattle, Abilene also found itself overrun by Texas cowboys. Per Joseph Rosa in his book, they called him Wild Bill, quote, "The cowboys' arrival in town, sometimes after spending 3 months on the trail, was heralded by a chorus of shouts and pistol shots, and by the sound of galloping horses. The very first chance he got to let her rip, he did so, and once he had drink inside him, he often became an almost maddened creature." End of quote. Of course, it wasn't just the cowboys who were causing problems. Cowtowns were no different than other boom towns in the sense that they drew in the same types of fringe elements. Pimps, thieves, con artists, gamblers, and all manner of ne'er-do-wells. Things eventually got so bad that Abilene's founding fathers started shopping around for a city marshal. And as fate would have it, Tom Bear River Smith was one of the very first applicants. Only thing is, the city officials weren't impressed, so they passed him over. According to Abilene's first mayor, Theodore Henry, quote, "Successive marshals were tried, failed, and in turn resigned. The chief of police of St. Louis was implored to send us a couple of men competent to come and run the town for us. In a few days they appeared, vouched for, to fill our order. Their identity and mission were soon known all over town. Every device lawless deviltry could contrive was let loose that day. The brace of tenderfeet, without tendering their farewell compliments, took the return midnight train for Missouri. End of quote. So, with nowhere else to turn, they sent a wire to Smith, asking him to reapply. He did so and was officially hired on June 4th, 1870. Per historian Leon Metz, quote, Smith told the town council that Abilene would never be tamed until the cowboys surrendered their weapons before entering town. So when city fathers passed the necessary ordinance, Smith enforced it first against a bully named Big Hank. When Hank went for his gun, Smith knocked him unconscious with one punch. A week later, the marshal took another man's weapon away from him and beat the surprised individual savagely about the head and body, punctuating the fight with an order to leave town in 5 minutes. Turned out to be 3 minutes longer than needed. End of quote. And yeah, from that point on, the word spread. What's more, Abilene's permanent residents, long used to avoiding the streets after dark, once again felt safe. Hell, they even gave Smith a bump in his salary. Of course, not everyone appreciated his methods. Tom would survive at least 2 assassination attempts during his first few months there in Abilene. But for the time being, at least, his strategy did work. Abilene finally had law and order. And the best part was, Smith didn't even have to draw his revolver to accomplish it. Now, as wild as Abilene may have been, things would usually settle down come wintertime. With all the cowboys back in Texas, there really wasn't much for Smith to do. So he ended up taking a commission as a deputy U.S. Marshal. He also accepted the position as undersheriff for Dickinson County. Matter of fact, it was in said capacity that he tracked down a horse thief known as Buckskin Bill Phillips, caught up with him at his home in Brownville, Nebraska, and took him into custody without incident. The only thing was, Bill had already sold off most of the stolen stock, and the folks who bought him weren't exactly chomping at the bit to hand him over to the likes of Tom Smith, especially without reimbursement, to the point that they actually threatened the lawman's life. Nevertheless, Smith stood his ground, and he was able to retrieve most of the horses, once again without firing a single shot. Not long thereafter, he took on a shanty town northwest Abilene, a notorious cluster of brothels and gambling joints that catered to the worst of the worst. Tom gave the madams a simple choice: either pack up and leave or face arrest. And within days, the entire settlement was gone. These aren't exactly the type of flashy gunfights or showdowns that we normally discuss here on the Wild West Extravaganza, but these little victories made a huge difference. Smith was building a reputation as a marshal who could handle pretty much anything, whether it was drunken cowboys, Nebraska horse thieves, or even sassy madams. He always seemed to know exactly what to do. And thanks to his efforts, Abilene was safer than ever. But be that as it may, and unbeknownst to anyone but God, Smith's time on Earth was quickly drawing to an end. Per historian Johnny Boggs, quote, in late October of 1870, Andrew McConnell killed John Shea on Chapman Creek. McConnell turned himself in, and Moses Miles testified that the killing was in self-defense, so McConnell was released. Neighbors, however, suggested that Shea, who left behind a widow and 3 children, was not the aggressor, so Dickinson County Sheriff James McDonald asked Smith to go with him to bring in McConnell. End of quote. The pair arrived at McConnell's dugout on November 2nd. Locating both he and his buddy, Moses Miles, same guy who testified on his behalf a few days prior. And what happened next is not entirely clear. We don't know exactly what was said or how quickly things escalated, but what we do know is that McConnell abruptly shot Smith through the right lung. Tom then uncharacteristically pulled his revolver and returned fire, wounding McConnell, after which the two began grappling. Smith managed to get the upper hand despite his wound, but that's when Moses Miles joined the fray. He began clubbing Tom upside the head with a rifle to little effect, so finally he grabbed an axe, took a swing, and nearly severed Smith's head from his body. Now I know what you're thinking. Where was Deputy McDonald as all this was happening? Well, as it turns out, he had hauled ass just as soon as that first shot was fired. He went back to Abilene for help, and when the posse arrived, the killers were long gone. As I'm sure you can imagine, news of the marshal's death stunned Abilene. For months, the town had enjoyed a level of peace unknown since the cattle drives had first began, largely thanks to Tom Smith's firm but fair approach to law enforcement. And now the man who had single-handedly tamed the streets lay dead, murdered in one of the most brutal attacks anyone could remember. To say that people were outraged would be an understatement. Hell, even the Kansas Weekly Tribune was calling for a little extrajudicial justice. Quote, if the murderer is not caught and lynched forthwith, it will be a disgrace to the locality. End of quote. Now, like I said, McConnell and Miles took off, but they wouldn't make it any further than Clay Center, Kansas before being arrested. Moses would be convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 16 years in the Kansas State Penitentiary. As for McConnell, he initially pled not guilty, but later changed his plea to first-degree manslaughter, earning him a 12-year sentence. But you know how it goes. In the end, Miles was pardoned after just 6 years, and McConnell was released in 1881. A bitter pill for the citizens of Abilene, many of whom felt that no amount of time in prison could make up for the savage killing of Marshal Smith. This episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is brought to you by me, Josh. Let me ask you a question real quick. What if every time you went to go check the date, you discovered something new about the Old West? Or better yet, what if you found out that you shared a birthday with someone like Jesse James? Or that your wedding anniversary was on the same day as the Battle of Little Bighorn? Sounds pretty cool, right? Well, that's why I went ahead and created the Legends and Outlaws wall calendar. And no, this is not just some boring calendar with the show's logo plastered on it. Not only does it include traditional holidays, stuff like Christmas and 4th of July, but you'll also find all kinds of notable dates from the Old West. Everything from birthdays to deaths and even historic shootouts involving guys like Billy the Kid and Wild Bill Hickok. For instance, I am currently recording this on October 27th. Hang on a second. Here we go. October 27th, 2025 is when I'm recording this ad spot right now, okay? Just yesterday was the 144th anniversary of the gunfight at the OK Corral. And today, at least as of this recording, marks the birthday of Joseph Medicine Crow. I did an episode on Mr. Medicine Crow a long time ago, but if you're not familiar, he was the last war chief of the Great Crow Nation. This dude was raised by actual warriors who roamed the Great Plains and grew up to count coup on Nazis during World War II. And if there's one thing I like more than Old West history, it's Nazis getting their heads bashed in. And tomorrow, at least as of this recording, marks the birth of the great cattle king, John Chisholm. It's all here on the calendar, and as you can see, there were plenty of other notable dates that also occurred in October. Everything from the Daltons getting wiped out over in Coffeyville to the death of Richard Two Gun Hart. Remember him, Al Capone's prohibition agent brother? And even the day that Tom Tobin delivered the head of Felipe Espinosa. It's all there on the calendar. But wait, there's more. Each month also features a different full-page historical photo. And yeah, the photos are different for every single month. We got everyone from Billy the Kid to Judge Roy Bean, and even my own personal favorite, Sitting Bull wearing sunglasses. Okay, so if you're tired of boring wall calendars and you want to surround yourself with all the gunslingers and warriors and outlaws of the American West that we normally talk about here on the Wild West Extravaganza, head on over to wildwestcalendar.com and secure a calendar, or 2 or 3. I really do think this is a great gift for any history buffs in your life, or Western fans, or just anyone who appreciates a nice quality piece of art. And it's just in time for Christmas, all right? Or Hanukkah or Kwanzaa or whatever you celebrate. So what are you waiting for? That's wildwestcalendar.com. Wildwestcalendar.com, wildwestcalendar.com. Don't just mark the date, make it legendary. Now, let's get back to the show. Now, Tom's funeral took place on November 4th, 1870, just 2 days after his death. Most of the town showed up to pay their respects as Tom's beloved horse, Silver Hills, trotted riderless behind the hearse, his former owner's revolvers draped over the saddle horn. As far as the marshal vacancy goes, Abilene's founders soon found a likely candidate in the form of a lanky dandy by the name of James Butler Hickok, aka Wild Bill. And with such a famous replacement, it's only natural that Smith's life would soon be overshadowed. But be that as it may, not everyone forgot about him. In 1904, more than 3 decades after his death, the town exhumed Smith's remains and reburied him in a place of honor. A massive red granite boulder weighing more than 2 tons was brought in from Oklahoma to mark the grave, and on it was affixed a bronze plaque which reads the following: Thomas J. Smith, Marshal of Abilene. Died a martyr to duty, November 2nd, 1870. A fearless hero of frontier days, who in cowboy chaos established the supremacy of law. For many of Abilene's residents, the tribute was long overdue. And one of those residents was a young man who grew up to become the 34th President of the United States. That's right, Dwight D. Eisenhower was raised right there in Abilene, Kansas. Hell, he even graduated from Abilene High School just a few years after Smith was reinterred. Later on, as president, he would visit Tom's grave on multiple occasions, describing the marshal as a man who, Almost never carried a pistol, but subdued the lawless by the force of his personality and his tremendous capability as an athlete. And yeah, I guess that's about all I've got on Tom Bear River Smith.
Yeehaw!
You ever hear of a gunfighter so slippery that he was able to dodge bullets, murder charges, and possibly even gravity itself? Meet mysterious Dave Mather, part outlaw, part lawman, and total question mark. Mather may have ran with the likes of Wyatt Earp and Dirty Dave Rudaball, but at the very peak of his infamy, he simply vanished. No grave, no body, no final dramatic shootout, nothing. He was just gone. The only question is where. How true are the stories about Dave fleeing to Canada and becoming a Mountie? What about the rumors that he was killed by moonshiners in Tennessee, or that he reinvented himself out west in California? Or did something far stranger catch up with him? Something otherworldly, perhaps. And yeah, I am referring to little green men from outer space. Buckle up, because this one is definitely gonna get weird. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. David Allen Mather was born on August 10th, 1851, in what's now known as Deep River, Connecticut. And for those of you looking for a thorough rundown of Dave's early life, well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there's just not a lot out there. Story goes that Dave's father, Ulysses, abandoned the family in 1856 to become a ship captain, which in hindsight may not have been all that great of a decision, as he was murdered by his own crew in 1864. Sadly, Dave's mother, Lydia, would also die before he reached adulthood. By 1860, he was living with his maternal grandfather, and by 1870, an either 18 or 19-year-old Mather could be found on the federal census living in Westbrook, Connecticut, employed as a laborer. It wasn't until later on in that same year that he and his little brother Josiah followed in their daddy's footsteps and took to sailing the high seas. Just not for very long. As soon as their cargo ship docked in New Orleans, the boys headed inland. And that's where things start to get really mysterious. For the next few years, we really don't have any idea what Dave was up to. There are rumors, though. Boy, howdy are there. Mostly unsubstantiated stories claiming that he did everything from hunting bison on the Kansas prairie to rustling cattle with Dave Rudaball over in Arkansas. Hell, there's even an unverified report of him running a con game down in Texas with none other than Wyatt Earp. About the closest I can find to an actual verified mention comes from a Dodge City newspaper in 1879, which named him as a regular associate of the notorious horse thief Dutch Henry Bourne. So yeah, as you can see, there's about a decade there where we honestly don't really know what mysterious Dave Mather was up to. What we know for certain, though, is that by the late 1870s, he was running with the Dodge City gang down in Las Vegas, New Mexico. East Las Vegas, New Mexico, to be exact. Now, if you're a longtime listener, you've heard me mention these guys many times in the past. But for those of you who are new, the Dodge City Gang was essentially just a loose network of gamblers, saloon owners, and gunmen led by an old boy by the name of Hyman Neal, aka Hoodoo Brown. In fact, Hoodoo, in addition to serving as mayor of East Las Vegas, was also the town coroner, the justice of the peace, and even the chief constable. His deputies included such Old West luminaries as Dirty Dave Rudaball, Tom Pickett, Joe Carson, J.J. Webb, and yeah, even our very own mysterious Dave Mather. I keep wanting to call him Mathers, but I'm pretty sure he's not related to Eminem, so I'll try to rein that in. By the way, a lot of these guys had been previously acquainted back in Dodge City, hence the name, the Dodge City Gang. So I do think it's likely that mysterious Dave also spent time in Dodge before drifting south. It's also worth noting that these guys were just a little bit on the crooked side. Hell, Rudaball and Joe Carson would even rob a stagecoach outside of Vegas in August 1879, a crime that was ultimately pinned on 3 innocent men. They would occasionally do real honest-to-God police work, though, like in late January of 1880, when Dave and Carson responded to a disturbance over at the Close and Patterson Variety Hall. Per historian David G. Thomas, quote, on January 22nd, 4 Texas Panhandle cowboys, Tom Dutch Henry, James West, William Tom Randall, and Jim Loco Dorsey, rode into Las Vegas with the intention of settling a score with Las Vegas Constable Joe Carson. A week earlier, Carson had questioned the men about stealing a 2-horse buggy, for which there was an enticing $500 reward. He was driven off with harsh words. About 11 p.m., the 4 men entered the Close and Patterson's late-night dance hall, belligerently drunk and heavily armed. End of quote. When mysterious Dave finally arrived on the scene, he requested that the cowboys check their sidearms with the bartender. They refused and began hurling insults at him. They then turned their attention to Deputy Carson, saying that no man could make them give up their pistols. Then, without warning, Tom Henry shucked iron and put a bullet in Carson's left arm. Mysterious Dave responded by shooting Henry, at which point all hell broke loose. According to a local paper, the lamps in the dance hall were extinguished by the repeated concussions, and then followed a scene that beggars description. At least 30 shots were fired almost simultaneously, the leaden missiles of death flying as thick as hailstones around the crowded room. And yeah, when the smoke cleared, Joe Carson was dead, and Randall lay mortally wounded. His buddy James West was likewise wounded, and apparently in all the chaos, the other two cowpokes, Henry and Dorsey, were able to escape. As for Mather, he proved to be just as lucky as he was mysterious. Whereas Carson had been riddled with no less than 8 bullets, Dave had received nothing more than a grazing wound. Well, just 3 days later, on January 25th, he would kill yet again. This time a guy by the name of Joseph Costello, a railroad foreman who had made the grave mistake of going for his pistol during an argument. Luckily for Dave, a coroner's jury would rule the killing as self-defense. Imagine that. Now, be that as it may, the good citizens of East Las Vegas were very quickly growing weary of Mather and his associates. The following month, those two guys who escaped that gunfight, Henry and Dorsey, they were apprehended and thrown in the same jail as their wounded compadre, James West. And a couple of nights after that is when the vigilantes came a-calling. The prisoners were taken to the town square, where one of them was lynched from the windmill. The other two were forced to stand on said windmill, as, according to the paper out of Santa Fe, they were quote-unquote perforated with bullets. Bullets that were allegedly fired by Joe Carson's widow. Now, we don't know whether or not Dave Mather took part in these unsanctioned killings, but considering his friendship with Carson and his position as constable, I'm willing to bet that at the very least he turned a blind eye. Skip ahead to early March, and another Vegas deputy, J.J. Webb, shot and killed a freighter named Michael Kelleher. Per the March 9th, 1880 edition of the Dodge City Globe, quote, at about 4 a.m., 3 men, headed by Michael Kelleher, entered the Goodlet and Robert Saloon. All being intoxicated and heavily armed, they soon became very boisterous. Police Officer Webb, being present and fearing that trouble would arise, ordered them to depart. Kelleher refused, exclaiming, "I won't be disarmed." He drew his pistol and was just in the act of leveling the weapon when Webb, taking in the situation at once, and quick as a wink, pulled his pistol and instantly fired a ball into his chest. Kelleher dropped to his side but still showed fight. The officer fired twice more, balls lodging in the breast and head. Kelleher dropped over on the floor and died without speaking. End of quote. And yeah, that's the official story, but things may have been a tad bit more complicated than reported. You see, the victim, Michael Kelleher, had just finished driving a load of freight all the way from South Dakota and had over $2,000 on his person, which, adjusted for inflation, is close to $64,000 in today's money. Just so happens that Dirty Dave Rudaball was also in the saloon when Kelleher was killed, as was the mayor/coroner, Hoodoo Brown. And surprise, surprise, according to both Dave and Brown, the killing was justifiable. And to be honest, that might be true. I mean, there are people even to this day who do think that Webb was justified. Others, however, maintain that he assassinated Kelleher on orders from Hoodoo. Matter of fact, Hoodoo would actually skip town shortly thereafter with the money that they took off of Kelleher's body. Wasn't long before a judge put 2 and 2 together and had Webb arrested and charged with murder. That was in early March of 1880, okay? A month later, Rudaball and one of his buddies gunned down a respected jailer while attempting to bust Webb out of the clink. A senseless killing that proved to be the last straw for the good folks of East Las Vegas. They soon formed a vigilance committee and put what remained of the Dodge City gang on notice. Rather than stick around and wait on a hangman's noose, Mysterious Dave wisely chose to try his luck in a more agreeable climate. And by a more agreeable climate, I do mean Dodge City, Kansas. Just in time for the Dodge City War. Now, this so-called war is nowhere near as exciting as the name suggests. In all reality, it was just a highly publicized standoff between the mayor, Larry Degger, and a gambler by the name of Luke Short. And by the way, if you're interested in learning more about some of these people I'm naming, I do have a full episode on Dave Rudaball, and I also have an entire episode devoted to Luke Short and the Dodge City War. I'll drop some links down below if you're curious. But basically, Degger was just trying to force Short out of town. So in turn, Luke assembled a team of badasses, including Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and former sheriff Charlie Bassett. With support from the governor of Kansas and growing pressure from economic powerhouses like the Santa Fe Railroad, both sides were eventually able to resolve their differences. And Luke Short's Long Branch Saloon was allowed to reopen. The entire ordeal proved completely bloodless, but the presence of so many noted gunmen did make the citizens of Dodge somewhat nervous, which may have been how Mather landed the job as assistant marshal in the first place. I didn't mention that yet, did I? Yeah, so when he got to town, he was made assistant marshal, a position that he would only hold for a very short amount of time. There would be another election shortly thereafter, and the new mayor appointed the legendary Bill Tillman as the new town marshal. He also replaced Mysterious Dave with a former buffalo hunter named Tom Nixon. In other words, Mather was out of a job. Kind of. I mean, he was still a deputy sheriff for Ford County at the same time. And the following month, after he lost his position as assistant marshal, he purchased the Opera House Saloon with his buddy, David Black. So it's not like he was destitute or anything, but he did seem to harbor a grudge against his replacement, Tom Nixon. More on Tom in just a moment. In the meantime, Mather busied himself renovating the saloon into a dance hall. Or at least he did until the city council ordered him to stop. They even passed an ordinance outlawing, quote, what is commonly known as a dance hall, or any other place where lewd women and men congregate with the purpose of dancing or otherwise, end of quote. Otherwise doing a lot of work there. Only problem was the ordinance wasn't being fairly enforced. In fact, Dave's rival, the aforementioned Tom Nixon, also owned a dance hall known as the Lady Gay. Now, whereas Dave's joint was effectively put out of business, Nixon was allowed to continue hosting dancing gals with zero repercussions. Whether or not this was a deliberate favoritism or just selective enforcement is unclear, but it certainly did add fuel to an already simmering fire. So Mather fought back by lowering the price of beer to just 5 cents a glass, less than half of what the Lady Gay was charging. In turn, Nixon and the other saloon owners retaliated by pressuring wholesalers to cut off Mather's supply of beer. And just to further aggravate matters, evidence suggests that Mysterious Dave may have had the hots for Nixon's wife, Cornelia. Not sure how true that is, but I do know that things finally came to a head on the evening of July 18th, 1884. Dave was standing on the steps in front of his saloon when all of a sudden Nixon walked up and opened fire. Keep in mind that Nixon is acting assistant marshal at this point, and he just walks up and tries to murder a dude. Per the July 19th edition of the Dodge City Democrat, quote, the bullet went wild and struck the woodwork of the porch. Mather's face was considerably powder burned, and the little finger of his left hand was injured by a splinter, end of quote. Telling you, this dude was more lucky than he was mysterious. They should have called his ass Lucky Dave Mather. Now, Bill Tillman's wife Zoe would later remark somewhat prophetically that when it comes to a man like Dave Mather, you better shoot straight or not at all, because if you miss, he will get you. And sure enough, Tom Nixon got. Killing occurred just a few nights later as Nixon was making his rounds. Dave waited until the lawman was walking by and then called out his name. And then, according to the papers, quote, as Nixon turned around, Mather commenced shooting at him, firing 4 shots, killing him instantly. An eyewitness would later state that Dave told Nixon that he had lived long enough before finishing him off. And upon being arrested, he claimed that his only regret was not killing him 6 months earlier. No word on whether or not he was able to hook up with Cornelia. Now, Dave would be tried for murder, but this tends to be the case with these types of Old West shootouts. He was ultimately acquitted. You know, people have this idea of the Old West being very hard on crime, and I am here to tell you, after spending years researching this stuff, as long as you didn't fall prey to a lynch mob and you actually made it to trial, 9 times out of 10, you were going to get acquitted. And Mysterious Dave Mather was no different. Of course, it didn't hurt matters none that the sheriff testified on his behalf. So did Bat Masterson. Apparently, the locals were on his side as well, as the Dodge City Times would report that the courtroom broke out into applause when Mather received his acquittal. He wouldn't remain a free man for very long, though. He was soon joined there in Dodge by his little brother, Josiah. And in May of 1885, they got into a shooting scrape over at the Junction Saloon. Details are a little sketchy, but Dave and a gambler named Barnes got into an argument over a game of 7-Up. One thing led to another. Some sources claimed that Mather attempted to steal the pot, and when Barnes complained, Dave punched him in the face. And that's when Barnes went for his pistol. And once the smoke cleared, Barnes was dead and 2 bystanders were wounded. Dave was arrested yet again, but oddly enough, his pistol was found to be fully loaded, indicating that while he may have started the fight, he didn't actually take part in the shooting. Nevertheless, both he and his brother Josiah were charged with murder. The pair were able to post bond just a few weeks later, on July 29th, after which they promptly got the hell out of Dodge. And this is where things really start to get mysterious. We know that the brothers eventually split up shortly after leaving Dodge. Josiah would go to Utah and then Idaho, where he would continue living all the way until his death in 1932. Dave would make a brief stop in Topeka before taking a job as a city marshal in the town of New Kiowa, Kansas. Or at least that's what the Dodge City Times reported in August of 1885. Truth is, Mather did pay a visit to New Kiowa with his old saloon partner, David Black, but he was definitely not appointed as marshal. In fact, they were only in town for a few days before Black was forced to flee after killing a soldier. A lynch mob was formed, and after they failed to locate Black, they turned their attention on Mather, who likewise chose to haul ass. And that was it. That was the last, for sure, verified sighting of mysterious Dave Mather. To this day, nobody knows for certain what became of him. One of the earliest rumors regarding his fate comes from Dallas, Texas in 1886. That's when reports surfaced of an unidentified man's body being located next to the railroad tracks, dead from a gunshot wound to the head. Worth noting that no official record exists tying the body to Mather. Okay, I just want to make that clear. The alleged identification seems to have been based entirely on gossip. Another popular theory is that Dave drifted north and joined the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This particular story seems to originate in an article published in Everybody's Magazine in 1902, written by Edward Little. According to Little, Mather not only joined the Mounties, but he also robbed a stagecoach that he'd been assigned to protect. And once he was found out, he pulled yet another disappearing act. There's just one catch, though. The Mounties were pretty damn meticulous when it came to keeping records, and there is not a single reference to a David Mather ever serving with them. I suppose he could have enlisted under an alias, that's always possible, but at the same time, you have to consider the source. Little's reporting was based entirely on hearsay. But then again, there was another story that surfaced in the 1950s, alleging that Dave was serving with the Mounties as late as 1921. So who knows, there may be a kernel of truth in there, but once again, there is no actual proof. One of the more believable stories comes out of Long Pine, Nebraska in 1887. Just a couple of years after he disappeared. Numerous people who had allegedly known Dave from Dodge City claimed to have seen him living there in Nebraska. Others claim that Dave moved to California, where he started committing crimes under the alias of Dave Taylor, while others maintained that he retired as a U.S. Customs officer up in Washington State. His brother Josiah would later say that he was killed by moonshiners in the mountains of Tennessee, but at the same time, he told his children that he never saw Dave again after they parted company in Kansas. Now, my absolute favorite theory out of all of them is the one about him being abducted by aliens. And I'm not making this up, by the way. This is a real story, kind of. I mean, it's a story that I didn't make up, at least. Okay, so it first appeared in the Frontier Times magazine in 1963 and was quickly picked up by tabloids nationwide. According to the legend, Dave was hunting down cattle rustlers in northern Mexico in 1889 when he and his posse encountered what they described as a silver bowl in the sky. One of the members of the posse, a then teenager named Jorge Hernandez, would later claim on his deathbed that the UFO stayed just ahead of him, darting back and forth across the sky in spurts. And then when the group split up to investigate, Dave went down a canyon alone. And he never came out. The strange craft was then seen rising into the sky and vanished. The posse was able to locate Mather's horse, fully saddled and seemingly agitated, but there was absolutely zero sign of Dave. No footprints, no blood, nothing. They even had an indigenous tracker with them, who allegedly muttered, Pueblo de Cielo, or Cielo, whatever the fuck, Spanish for sky people, basically. And then he rode away and refused to ever speak of it again. Needless to say, there is no contemporary record of this ever happening, okay? The story didn't appear until decades later, and it was almost certainly born from someone's very active imagination. But damn it, it sure is fun to think about. Look, at the end of the day, nobody can say for certain what happened to mysterious Dave Mather. And in a way, I do think that's fitting, especially considering his nickname. But you tell me, What do you think? Was Dave really killed in Texas? Did he serve with the Mounties up in Canada? Or did he reinvent himself anew in California or Washington State? Hit me up at Josh at Wild West Extra or drop a comment down below. I am genuinely curious to hear your thoughts. Who knows, maybe the alien story is true and Dave is still out there somewhere, living in a galaxy far, far away. Maybe he's flying a starship across the universe divide. And maybe when he reaches the other side, he'll find a place to rest his spirit if he can. And perhaps he'll even become a highwayman again. Or hear me out, maybe Dave will become a single drop of rain. Whatever the case, I do think he will remain. And he'll be back again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again. And so will I, next week, with more true tells from the Wild West. Until then, be nice to one another, and adios.